And man, is there a whole lot going on in the world today. Good morning. It's really hard just to look at the headlines and try and figure out what to talk about as far as national news go. We've got Newt Gingrich coming to West Georgia, coming to the University of West Georgia. He'll be here this afternoon. The big ordeal is at 7 o'clock until 8 tonight, and that is in the UWG Campus Center ballroom, but he will be here prior to that. I believe he's going to be on campus around 5:30. I think the meet and greet is from 6 o'clock until 7, and if you purchase tickets, and I think you can even still buy tickets if you know who to talk to, for $50 and I think $100, depending, to actually get to shake the hand of and talk to Newt Gingrich if that's something you're interested in. Interestingly enough, one of my professors was explaining to me that, probably little known, that the email list of the faculty at the University of West Georgia is much ablaze with fiery comments back and forth between pro and anti-Newt Gingrich people, and the criticism of Newt Gingrich is not your stereotypical criticism either. A lot of it goes back to him working there previously, people who had worked with him years and years ago, and there probably aren't that many professors there still that taught there that long ago. I believe, because he hasn't taught there since the late 70s, I don't believe. Or at the very latest, the early 80s. I mean, that's 33 years. How many professors do you think are around that have been around that long? 33 years. So anyway, there's a few old professors that are still around, and they vehemently don't like Newt Gingrich for whatever reason. And a lot of them just aren't mentioning to their classes, for example, the man who could be, for whatever slim chance, could be the President of the United States. They really just don't, and political affiliations, I think, should be out of question. Whether you are a Republican college professor or whether you aren't a Republican college professor or whatever your political alliance is, I think it's important for you to encourage all of your students to go see someone who's this important. The governor is coming. There's going to be a lot of bigwigs at this event. All the local congressmen, I'm sure, are going to be there. Again, it's a presidential candidate. I don't care what party it is. Your students should be exposed to that. College students are largely, what's the nicest way to put this? Idiots when it comes to politics. They don't care, largely. They're the smallest voting sector, and in general, they just aren't very well informed. And I can tell you because I'm a political science major. Now, I'm roaming the halls with a bunch of political science majors, so we're all politically informed. But the vast majority of the English majors, early education majors, phys ed majors, maybe not so much business majors, but biology majors, chemistry majors, computer science majors, they don't care about politics. On the whole, college students just in general don't care about politics. It's honestly quite scary. There's plenty of videos and surveys that have been done online, and professional video surveys where they literally walk around a university campus and ask simple history questions, politics questions. You know, who's the Secretary of State? Who's the Vice President? Who's the Speaker of the House? Who's the Majority Whip in the House? Who's the Minority Whip? And by and large, college students and high school students are even worse. They may even be the same, actually, from what I've seen. And it's really indicative of the state of our country, I think, the political disconnect. And I think that bothers me quite a lot. I think more people watch Entertainment Tonight than watch all of the news networks combined. And I don't think that is good for the Republic, for our country. I don't think it's good that people don't pay attention. I would rather you pay attention and be wrong than not pay attention at all. I will disagree with you 6 ways to Sunday until I'm blue in the face, but I would much rather see a country where people know things like who the Secretary of State is or who the Vice President is. Like I said, I've watched plenty of these videos online and these surveys where students were asked who the Vice President was of the United States, and this is a recent survey, and they were like, "Oh man, that's a toughie." There's a couple of girls in a college classroom. It's on the tip of my tongue, they were saying. And they came to the conclusion it's Osama bin Laden. That's right, that's the vice president. I've heard his name on the news. It's Osama bin Laden. And I couldn't believe my ears. I said, this cannot be real. This has to be staged. There is no way that this is real. That these two, they look like college freshmen perhaps, would seriously come to the conclusion that Osama bin Laden was a familiar name, and that's probably who the vice president is. And after a few minutes, they said, wait a minute, no, that's the terrorist guy. Who is the vice president? I just couldn't believe my ears, and there's no way it was staged. unless they're just really good actors. It seemed completely legitimate, and I really hope it was staged, to be perfectly honest, because that is scary alone. Largely, and I think this is indicative of the age of our democracy, republic, whatever you'd like to call it, that over time, we've become like Athens and Rome in that we're under the asymptote. And what that means is that prosperity in a free society comes to the point where at the early stages of the country and the government, it grows very quickly. Wealth is grown at a very fast rate for the first 150 years of your typical democracy or republic. We're getting to the point where wealth still grows faster here than most places in the world, but compared to our parents and our grandparents, we are now under the asymptote. So where instead of growing exponentially higher, we're now growing at a consistently slower rate of growth. Still growing and growing fast. But we're at the point where it's not easy anymore. It's not the 80s and the 90s, where everybody was making good money compared to the cost of living. The dollar is worth half what it was 30 years ago. Medical care costs 4 times what it did 30 years ago. College costs 5 times what it did 30 years ago. Is that good for the country? Are we getting a 5 times better education? No, but we sure have a nice football stadium and a nice basketball stadium and a $6.5 million bookstore. Lots of nice things, that's for sure. But do we have a nice education because of it? Is our retention rate getting better at the university or any university? I'm not trying to pick on the University of West Georgia. I think it's a pretty solid school. I really do. But we'll come back after the break, and we'll switch gears here a little bit, considering there's very big news over the weekend that I'd like to discuss and maybe get some phone calls on. There was a school shooting in Ohio this past week. I haven't followed it terribly closely, but I'm taking a politics and gun control class so I can elaborate on what I've learned about gun control in the next segment. So please feel free to give me a call. The telephone number is 678-601-8255 if you'd like to be part of the program. Again, that number is 678-601-TALK if you'd like to call in. We'll be right back after the break. Alrighty, and we are back. So, last Monday, it appears, in Chardon, Ohio, a teen gunman had opened fire inside a high school cafeteria at the start of classes, killing 1 student and wounding 4 others, police said. Now, this must be yesterday. Like I said, I haven't followed it closely. I just saw the headlines, and it's a little shocker to me. I know it's a big deal. I mean, Columbine was clearly a big deal. But and now the 2nd student has died in this Ohio school shooting. 5 total students shot, and now the 2nd one reported dead. A very tragic event, very sad. So I'm not trying to gloss over anything here too heavily, at least. But the gun control thing is a big deal. And you know, I just wrote one of my reaction papers. We actually I have a politics and gun control class. Full disclosure here. We have a lot of reading to do. There are 6 assigned textbooks for the course, and there are several other scanned PDFs, plus the professor's own book he's given to us in the form of a Word document that's, I believe, an incomplete book. And it's very good, actually. It analyzes a lot of modern writing and kind of puts its own deal on gun control and trends like that. And the section we had to read yesterday was kind of the long-term national trend of gun control as far as public opinion goes. And it's very neat to me to see that 30 years ago, for example, about 75 to 80% of the country, public opinion-wise, favored gun control. And the basic poll question is this: do you favor less or more strict policies on gun control. And 30 years ago, about 70-ish% of the country favored stricter regulations on gun ownership. That trend today is much closer to about 50-55%. So still an overwhelming majority of the country do favor gun control. Now, what does that mean, though, as well? Once you start asking more specific questions, it really, really gets a little hairy. When you talk about banning guns, for example, by and large, the country does not favor that. About 75 or 80% of the country says, no, we cannot outright ban firearms. Now, support for serial numbers, for example, that are much harder to remove, very tamper-resistant serial numbers on handguns, that is overwhelmingly supported, 85, 90%, somewhere in that ballpark. I read this last night, so I'm pulling this out of thin air. Handgun registration, a little less support, but still overwhelmingly supported that handguns be registered. Shotguns, a little less support for registration of shotguns. So when you get to the nitty-gritty, the details of what it is, when the country says they favor gun control, does that mean they want no guns in households? Not so much. They just think that laws could better be made to protect children. Safety locks, for example, coming as a feature of a pistol. Trigger safeties, things like that. More innovative gun technology to promote safety, to prevent accidental death by children, because that's one of the big topics along with that as well. And what's interesting to me is that over time, and this ties into a lot of things, is that really over time, if you look at the last 100 years, for example, gun accidents among children were on a sharp decline. A sharp decline. The same thing for gun accidents among adults as well. Sharp decline. But even still, the public opinion, and largely the public opinion, is uninformed. Something I touched on earlier to come full circle a little bit is that the general public doesn't know things about real crime statistics and things like that. And you can make numbers say whatever they want, but by and large, both sides have to agree that accidents have been coming down on a national scale here. Gun ownership has gone up significantly in the last 20 years. Gun control was a big issue during the Clinton administration, thanks to Columbine and Stockton as well. It takes a few years for the ball to get rolling on these things. So gun control is a fairly fresh issue on the national level. But still, nothing ever happens. And my politics and gun control classes really taught me how influential the NRA is. And I like and don't like the NRA all at the same time. It's kind of interesting. Now, there are a lot of perks to being in the NRA. I'm not saying that being in the NRA is not justified, but the way they do things might make you reconsider your membership to the NRA. They're very effective, that's absolutely sure. And the reason there isn't a gun control movement that is as cohesive as the NRA is very simple. The NRA is very much the status quo. They make the slippery slope argument. Don't let them get in at all, because if they do get in with gun control, you won't have guns at all. Eventually, they're going to take your guns from you. So call it a scare tactic as you will, but it's also a legitimate political argument that if one thing happens this year, it's more likely that the same thing could happen a few years down the road, and eventually, by the process of incrementalism, as it's called, you will lose your guns. And that's the argument the NRA makes. The problem that the gun control groups face is that while a majority of Americans do agree with at least some level of gun control, the problem is that they are so fractured. The Americans who do support, who are pro-gun, are very, very well organized. They generally agree on gun legislation, typically just the status quo. They all agree on one thing, for the intent of my argument here, whereas the gun control advocates don't all agree on one thing. Some think that all guns should be banned. Others think just pistols. Others think that we should just regulate pistols. We should make gun manufacturers pay for training courses. The gun control thing just is all over the place. They don't agree on anything. As a matter of fact, most of the gun control groups fight with each other just as much as they do the NRA. You've got the Brady campaign, you've got the Million Mom March, and countless other gun control groups that are just small. I'm not sure that any of them number over 1 million. I think the NRA's got, 4 or 5 million members now, and I don't think any of the gun control groups have over 1 million, but there's a lot of them, and they don't necessarily have an umbrella organization or anything like that. like the NRA is really kind of the go-to. And there are some state-level organizations, like I think Georgia Right to Carry is another one, is the one here locally. And the NRA, obviously being the national gun control, or pro-gun group anyway. So again, it's very complicated. And the biggest problem that I think the gun control advocates face is that the gun control argument is not a simple one to make, because if we take a look at Switzerland, for example, one of the highest gun-owning countries in the world, they also are one of the lowest crime countries in the world. Now, the United States is also one of the highest gun-owning countries in the world per capita. There's something like 230 to 250 million guns in the United States, if that's not scary enough. But we have a higher crime rate than most of the industrialized world. So what that tells us immediately, in my humble opinion, is that the gun control argument is far more complicated than guns equal crime. Culture plays a role. Income plays a role. Misperceptions about guns play a role. In my opinion, and one of our authors of the books that we have to read for class essentially concludes that gun control in the United States is never going to take the form of a ban, period. Because the status quo and the general public understanding that the Second Amendment applies as an individual right to own a firearm, people can debate that all they want, but the general perception of the United States public at large is that the Second Amendment guarantees you an individual right to a firearm, at least at the federal level. So a federal ban on guns, not going to happen. Now, a state one, that gets a little trickier, because any powers not expressed in the Constitution are reserved for the states by the 10th Amendment in the Constitution. So it gets a little hairier at the state level. Honestly, gun control legislation has a lot better of a shot at the local level, considering that the most powerful gun restrictions come from the municipal level, not even the state level. The municipal level actually has the most power over gun control. So the gun control groups are really kind of barking up the wrong tree when it comes to banning guns nationally. And this is the other problem that gun control groups have, is that they try and reach for far too much when it comes to the legislative process. They reach for the sky when it comes to things like that, and knee-jerk reactions don't do very well in our political system, because, and if I haven't mentioned this before, the founders formed our government on purpose to be broken. They wanted our government to be broken. They wanted it to be clunky. They didn't want a parliamentary system where you could elect in a coalition in a heartbeat and just pass law after law after law after law and make sweeping changes every time a new party comes into power. They didn't want that, because that creates instability. And we see that in Europe with the parliamentary systems. We see Britain, we see France, we see Greece with parliamentary systems all having serious issues with stability, because they get new governments every few years. The rules change, massive policy change every few years. And would you say Europe is stable politically or economically? I don't think so. They're having an awfully rough time, especially under the umbrella of the EU, with all the regulations and uniformity and solidarity, we'll call it, that the EU tries to provide among the financial institutions, national defense, foreign relations, things like that the EU does. So to come full circle again, the gun control argument is far more complicated than guns equal crime, to bring myself to a conclusion. We'll come back after the break, and if you'd like to call and make a comment about your opinion on gun control, I've got a couple things I'd like to say when I come back as well. It is time for a break. Back after this. Just a few minutes left in the program. It's 8:53. And I'd like to read from you, actually, a report that I found over the weekend that was very interesting, and I've actually emailed it to my politics and gun control professor. Hopefully we'll talk about it in class today, especially given the topic of the Ohio shooting yesterday as well. But I'm going to read from this report. If policymakers are truly interested in harm reduction, they should pause to consider how many crimes, murders, rapes, assaults, and robberies are thwarted each year by ordinary persons with guns. This paper uses a collection of news reports of self-defense with guns over an 8-year period to survey the circumstances and outcomes of defensive gun uses in America. The study by Gary Kleck and Mark Gertz found that there were somewhere between 830,000 and 2.45 million defensive gun uses per year in the U.S. The National Survey of Private Ownership of Firearms was performed in 1994. It found approximately 1.5 million defensive gun uses. The high-end figures on defensive gun uses may well suffer from exaggeration or outright lies, since the survey data has severe limitations with respect to defensive gun uses. Collecting accounts of self-defense as they are reported in news outlets may be a better method of assessing the frequency and nature of self-defense with firearms. The data set supporting this paper is derived from a collection of news stories published between October 2003 and November 2011. After Colorado's 2003 concealed carry law was enacted, Colorado State University decided to allow concealed carry, while the University of Colorado prohibited firearms. The former observed a rapid decline in reported crimes, while the latter, under the gun ban they claimed was for safety, observed a rapid increase in crime. Crime at the University of Colorado has risen 35% since 2004, while crime at Colorado State has dropped 60% in the same time frame. Many people support gun control regulations because they are convinced that the average citizen is either incapable of using a gun in self-defense or will use the gun in a fit of anger over some petty matter. Those assumptions are false. The evidence on this point has grown so strong that even President Obama has had to chide gun safety advocates to accept the proposition that almost all gun owners in America are highly responsible. And as the scores of incidents described in the study show, gun owners stop a lot of criminal mayhem, attempted murders, rapes, assaults, robberies every year. Policymakers interested in harm reduction should thus refrain from treating ordinary gun owners as hoodlums or loose cannons and adopt policies that respect the ownership and carrying of arms by responsible individuals. By the way, I think regardless of what policymakers decide, responsible and prudent people should own guns, even if it means breaking the law. Self-defense is a fundamental right. Whether you are defending yourself from crime, oppression, societal breakdown, period. Now, to bring this back to a local level, we actually have a bill in the Georgia General Assembly proposing to allow campuses to decide whether or not to open carry. So the bill may pass, and no colleges may allow carry conceal, except Georgia Southern, perhaps, or some other Southern Georgia college where they're a bit more conservative. I think the evidence is awfully compelling that you have two colleges in one state, one with an outright gun ban, the other one that allows carry conceal, and the evidence is conclusive. In 8 years, 9 years now, after the concealed carry law was enacted, the university that allows the carrying of firearms, crime has dropped 60%. In the university that has banned gun crime, it's risen 35%. While it's easy to make the case for carry conceal using one example, gun control, again, is a very complicated issue. It takes quite a lot of reading to get a real take on how things work around the world, what works where and what doesn't. You can take a policy that works one place and it may not necessarily work in the other, globally at least. Now, I think in the United States, things are generally pretty much the same because each state is really quite the melting pot, and maybe with the exception of Delaware or Massachusetts, but most states in the Union are a bit of a melting pot. They're very diverse. And I think there's certainly enough evidence to say that if you live in a carry state like Georgia, we are not a carry conceal state. We are a carry state. If you have a carry permit, you can carry it on your hip, you can carry it concealed, it doesn't matter. No longer do you have to worry about having a gun in your car. That changed recently too. Your car is an extension of your property. It is your property. You own it. It's yours. You can have a gun in there and not have a permit for it. You can transport a gun needing no permit whatsoever. But to have it on you, you have to have a carry permit. And that may change. We may become an open carry state. That's also being talked about as well. We may be like Texas or Montana, where you don't have to have a permit at all to wear it on your hip. And usually with open carry states, you do have to get a permit to carry conceal. And that's where carry conceal comes in. Usually carry conceal permits are just in open carry states, typically. That's the gun control stint in light of the recent news of a high school shooting, a very tragic event. And what's really sad about this is that the system has failed, because every time we see this school shooting thing, all of a sudden all of this information comes out of the woodwork about how it was an unstable child. He beat his mother, in this case. They have instability all the time. They're bullies. They're suspended a lot. there should really, the system failed. The school system failed. All the flags were given for years. This kid was unstable, and measures should have been taken to prevent a gun from getting into this very disturbed kid's hands. It was the same thing with Columbine. All the kids, deeply disturbed. Years of problems popping up in the school system, and they didn't do anything to prevent guns from getting into these kids' hands. So the lesson to be learned here is that we are responsible for gun control, not the government.